28 years ago, a 7-year-old boy vanished in broad daylight in Wilmington, Delaware, leaving no trace, devastating his family and plunging the entire neighborhood into confusion. Authorities suspected adult involvement and the possibility of abduction, but with no body found, very few leads to pursue, and the investigation eventually stalling. However, throughout those years, the boy's family never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that their son was still alive somewhere. Then one day, from an old file and a seemingly meaningless detail that everyone had overlooked, the case unexpectedly took a turn no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases like this, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Delaware in 1972 was one of the smallest and most peaceful states in the northeastern United States, where life moved slowly, communities were close-knit, and safety was almost taken for granted, especially in Wilmington, a port city large enough to offer steady jobs, but still retaining the feel of a familiar neighborhood where neighbors knew each other's names and children could freely walk to the nearby park or store without constant adult supervision. In that setting, the Alexander family lived in a typical working-class area, not wealthy, but stable, with a small house that always had lights on in the evening, and the familiar sounds of daily life repeating each day. Anthony Alexander, 7 years old, was the youngest child in the family. A skinny boy with dark hair that was always slightly messy from his habit of running around, quieter in personality than his peers, but very obedient, well-behaved, and trusted by his parents, with the level of freedom that was standard for the time. Anthony knew every street in the neighborhood, where the friendly neighbors' houses were, the small park where kids often gathered, and his connection to the last person supervising him that day was entirely based on trust, with no signs of conflict or unease. Everything unfolded like any other day, until a small detail, seemingly harmless, appeared and was later recognized as unusual. The brief presence of a stranger in the area, a situation not clear enough to raise alarm, but unusual enough to catch an adult's attention for a moment. That attention was quickly dismissed by the habit of reassuring oneself that this was a safe neighborhood, that there was no reason to suspect anything, that worry was just an overreaction, and that moment of hesitation created a brief lapse in supervision, where Anthony was no longer in direct sight of any adult. That lapse didn't last long, in ordinary terms, just a few minutes, but it was enough to shatter the order of what had been a peaceful day. When the family began to realize Anthony wasn't appearing on schedule as usual, the initial reaction wasn't panic, but complacency, assuming the boy was just caught up playing somewhere nearby. Then complacency turned to confusion, as familiar spots showed no sign of him, as his name was called louder and more urgently, and as spontaneous searches expanded beyond the yard and the street in front. Neighbors were asked, those who had seen him earlier tried to recall but couldn't provide definite information, each account vague, timelines not matching, directions unclear. Worry quickly turned to panic, as the family realized Anthony hadn't simply wandered off, that the boy had vanished from all the places considered safest for a 7-year-old. In that state of stress and desperation, the family had to face a decision they had never imagined in their peaceful life. They stopped the informal search, returned to the house that was starting to feel empty, and made the call to the Wilmington PD, officially acknowledging that Anthony Alexander was missing. The call from the Alexander family was received at the Wilmington PD toward the end of the day, during the shift changeover, and that timing immediately classified the case as an emergency, since the victim was a 7-year-old child who had disappeared without explanation in a residential area. Police responded according to standard protocol for missing children. A team was dispatched to the scene as quickly as possible, while desk officers began recording initial information, instructing the family to preserve the area around where Anthony was last seen. When police arrived, the atmosphere in the Alexander home had shifted from panic to numbness. Anthony's parents tried to recount everything that had happened that day, in a state of emotional turmoil, details coming out not in clear chronological order, many points repeated or slightly contradictory due to psychological pressure. This forced officers to ask clarifying questions repeatedly to separate speculation from verifiable facts. Alongside taking the family's statements, other officers quickly set up a perimeter around the surrounding area, including the street where the family lived, pedestrian paths leading to the park, and nearby side roads within close radius. The initial goal wasn't to search for complex evidence, but to prevent the possibility that Anthony was still in the area and overlooked due to random movement. This response reflected the common assumption at the time that most child disappearances in residential areas were due to getting lost or hiding to play longer. However, from the very first minutes, certain factors made officers uneasy about that assumption. There were no signs Anthony had voluntarily left his familiar area for an extended time. As witnesses were quickly brought in for statements, including neighbors, people who had seen Anthony that day, and those present near the time of disappearance, the picture remained fragmented. No one could confirm a specific direction of movement, no one was certain of exact times, and descriptions of any unusual details were too vague to become solid leads. This created a challenging situation for police in assessing the nature of the case, while the critical golden hour ticked away. At that point, Wilmington PD faced two main possibilities. Anthony might have wandered off and not yet been found due to limited initial search range, or the boy had been removed from the area by an external actor, a more serious scenario but lacking direct evidence to prove it. The initial assessment was crucial because it directly affected resource allocation, search priorities, and mobilization of support units. In the absence of specific evidence of violence or coercion, a cautious approach was chosen. While keeping abduction as an open possibility, police focused on urgent actions to ensure all nearby areas were thoroughly checked as soon as possible. The pressure of the golden hour in child disappearances made every small decision carry heavy weight, as real-world experience showed the chances of finding the victim safely decreased with each passing hour. Officers worked under extreme tension, gathering information from panicked people, while trying to stay sharp enough not to miss any detail that could become a lead. Meanwhile, Anthony's family began realizing the situation was beyond their control. The constant questions from police, though necessary, only highlighted their helplessness in not having definite answers for the most critical moments of the day. All these factors converged into a high-pressure starting point for the investigation, where Wilmington PD had to act quickly with limited information, tight timelines, and a victim too young to protect himself. And from that moment, the Anthony Alexander case officially entered the emergency investigation phase, with every decision governed by the harsh constraints of time. Immediately after the emergency response phase was activated, Wilmington PD's focus shifted to reconstructing as accurately as possible the final hours before Anthony Alexander's disappearance, because in child missing cases, determining the last confirmed sighting isn't just isolated information, it's the anchor point for the entire investigation chain. Officers started by cross-referencing statements from the family, neighbors, and anyone present in the area that day, to identify who saw Anthony last and when. This process quickly revealed a core difficulty. No witness could provide an absolutely precise time, since daily neighborhood activities followed routines rather than clocks, and everyone's memory was influenced by subjectivity. While Anthony's parents recalled seeing him shortly before noticing his absence, some neighbors believed they had seen him earlier in the day. This discrepancy forced police to create a broader time frame. Instead of pinpointing one moment, they divided the afternoon into 15-minute intervals to distinguish verifiable events from estimates, forming a preliminary timeline, where high-confidence points were marked separately from reference-only ones. As the timeline took shape, a gap became clear, the period when Anthony was not in direct sight of any adult. This gap wasn't hours long, but enough to create what investigators call the disappearance window, a limited time frame in which every possibility had to be seriously considered. Officers analyzed every factor around that window in detail: Anthony's movement habits, the distance a 7-year-old could cover alone in a short time, access points to the neighborhood, and potential outsider approach. Notably, when data was compared, the hypothesis of Anthony wandering off voluntarily started showing weaknesses. If he had simply left the familiar area, sightings on major roads or community alerts from nearby areas should have surfaced in the first hours, but none did. Alongside building the timeline, police also reviewed factors affecting statement accuracy, including witnesses' mental state when giving information and potential memory distortion from panic. This led to adjustments, narrowing or expanding some initial times based on source reliability. As the disappearance window became clearer, Wilmington PD began questioning the nature of the vanishing in that brief period. A 7-year-old was unlikely to completely disappear from a familiar neighborhood in minutes without external assistance. This didn't mean ruling out wandering entirely, but it required seriously considering adult intervention, direct or indirect. To assess this, they analyzed routes a vehicle could quickly access the area, time needed to exit the initial search radius, and whether such an action could occur unnoticed. These questions weren't for immediate conclusions, but to determine if the abduction hypothesis had enough basis to stand alongside others early on. Building the timeline also revealed that some seemingly minor details from initial statements, when placed in proper temporal context, took on new meaning: moments of hesitation, lapses in constant watching, or seconds when everyone assumed Anthony was nearby, all combined into a picture where the disappearance happened, not in chaos, but in abruptly interrupted normalcy. And that very normalcy made the case harder to grasp, with no clear warning signs of a major event. When investigators completed the preliminary timeline and defined the disappearance window, they faced an unwelcome reality. There was a clear enough interval for an intentional act to occur, but no direct evidence to prove it. The assessment of possible adult involvement was noted as a hypothesis to monitor closely, but couldn't yet become the official conclusion, as everything still relied on inferences from gaps rather than hard facts. And the fragility of those facts made building the timeline one of the most critical and difficult tasks of the early investigation, where every minute and hour was weighed, not just to determine where Anthony had been, but to answer the bigger question of how the boy had left his familiar world in a time frame so short it was hard to believe. From the preliminary timeline and the newly established disappearance window, Wilmington PD quickly shifted to a larger-scale action phase. Because in a context where time was not on the victim's side, every hypothesis needed to be verified through on-the-ground searches. Police forces were augmented with units from neighboring areas, while calls for assistance were issued to the community to mobilize volunteers, neighbors, and people familiar with the terrain to join the sweep. Initial search areas focused on a radius close to where Anthony was last seen, including adjacent streets, backyards, pedestrian paths, small parks, and vacant lots that normally received little attention. At the same time, police also had to consider the possibility that Anthony had moved farther away in a short period, leading to the decision to expand the search to major traffic routes, bus stops, residential entry-exit points, and roads that could quickly connect out of Wilmington. The coordination between police and the community created a dense search grid, but it also revealed limitations when information was gathered from many different sources, with varying degrees of accuracy. Every area checked was marked, ruled out, or retained for re-examination if needed. And it was during this expanded search that the first piece of evidence directly related to Anthony began to appear: a personal item discovered in a location not too far from the disappearance area, but also not entirely consistent with the hypothesis that Anthony had wandered off on his own. The discovery of the evidence immediately drew the investigation team's attention, not only for its identification value, but also for the spatial context in which it was found. Police carefully documented the exact location, the the distance from the last point Anthony was seen, and the surrounding conditions at the time of discovery. The item was preserved and tagged according to protocol to avoid contaminating information, while on-scene officers began asking questions about how the item ended up there, whether it fell during a child's spontaneous movement, or was placed there after Anthony had left the area by some other means. Analyzing the condition of the evidence became the next critical step, because the state of the item, any damage or cleanliness, and whether it showed signs of environmental exposure could all provide indirect clues about the timing and circumstances of its appearance. These details were cross-referenced with the previously constructed timeline to see whether they aligned with the assumption that Anthony had remained in the area for an extended period. When the data were placed side by side, some initial hypotheses began to form, including the possibility that the evidence reflected a brief stop during movement, or the final trace before Anthony left the area, in a manner inconsistent with the capabilities of a 7-year-old child. However, investigators also had to be cautious not to attribute more meaning to the evidence than it could prove, because experience showed that many missing child cases had been misled by clues that seemed important, but were ultimately unrelated to the act that caused the disappearance. While one team focused on analyzing the evidence, others continued expanding the search to farther areas, including major roadways where a vehicle could quickly approach and depart. This expansion aimed not only to find Anthony, but also to determine whether any witnesses outside the initial residential area had seen the boy or a noteworthy situation within the disappearance window timeframe. Reports collected during this phase were still mostly speculative, but when placed in the overall search context, they helped police build a clearer picture of what had not happened, that is, the routes, areas and scenarios that could be ruled out, while narrowing the remaining possibilities. The first piece of evidence, though not enough to reach a conclusion, served as a new anchor point for the investigation, forcing investigators to re-examine some initial assumptions and pose more specific questions about the sequence of events, if Anthony had wandered off. Why did the evidence appear in that location, and in that condition, and if there was adult intervention, was this item the result of an unintentional act or part of a deliberate sequence? Initial hypotheses surrounding the evidence were recorded in parallel, from the least serious possibilities to scenarios that required re-evaluating the entire investigative direction, but at this point, police still lacked sufficient basis to prioritize a single hypothesis. That caution reflected the pressure of an ongoing search under tight time constraints, incomplete information, and a victim for whom every passing hour increased the potential danger. As the day wore on and more search areas were marked, Wilmington PD had to confront the reality that despite the expanded effort and maximum mobilization of available resources, results still fell short of expectations. The first piece of evidence provided a foothold for analysis, but also highlighted the absence of other direct signs, and it was this contrast that made the wide-scale search phase a pivotal turning point, not only for what was found, but for what remained completely absent, laying the groundwork for subsequent investigative decisions, as investigators had to reassess the viability of each hypothesis based on the scant but decisive data they had in hand. While the wide-scale search continued in parallel, Wilmington PD's focus gradually shifted to systematizing and analyzing all witness statements collected in the initial hours and days, because with physical evidence so limited, human information became the primary data source for reconstructing what happened around Anthony Alexander's disappearance window. Officers reviewed every statement related to strangers in the area, from neighbors living near the Alexander family to individuals who merely passed through the neighborhood that day. What quickly became apparent was that most reports of strangers were fleeting. No one could definitively confirm the identity, purpose, or specific actions of any individual. Descriptions typically revolved around vague characteristics, such as an unfamiliar man, an odd demeanor, or a presence that didn't fit the neighborhood's usual rhythm, but none were specific enough to create a usable composite for pursuit. At the same time, data on suspicious vehicles were compiled. Some witnesses mentioned unfamiliar cars parked briefly or driving slowly through the area during the time Anthony vanished, yet descriptions of color, make or direction of travel did not match, and in some cases the same vehicle was described in two different colors. This forced investigators to consider the possibility that witnesses' memories were affected by time, stress, and information received from others after the incident. When statements were placed side by side and compared chronologically, contradictions emerged not only in details but in context. Some witnesses believed they saw Anthony with an adult, while others said the boy was alone. Some claimed to have seen him later than the family provided timestamp, while others were certain Anthony had not appeared in the area from early on. These contradictions did not necessarily stem from dishonesty, but largely reflected the natural limits of human memory in situations not intentionally recorded. For Wilmington PD, the greatest challenge was not a lack of witnesses, but an excess of fragmented information that could not be connected into a coherent sequence of events. Tracing limitations became evident when potential leads could not be corroborated by physical evidence or objective data. In the 1972 context, there were no surveillance cameras, no automated license plate systems, and no federal databases for quickly cross-referencing people and vehicles, making every tracing effort almost entirely dependent on the accuracy of witness memory, an inherently fragile factor. Officers had to continually assess the reliability of each source, considering the witness's relationship to the victim's family, their position at the time of the incident, and the possibility they were influenced by post-event conversations with others. Evaluating witness reliability became a complex process in which each statement was categorized by credibility based on multiple criteria, including internal consistency, independent verifiability, and alignment with known timeline facts. Statements that were speculative or clearly influenced by panic were noted but not used as the basis for major investigative decisions, while the few details showing overlap across sources were retained for follow-up, even though they were still not strong enough for concrete action. During this process, investigators also faced an unavoidable reality. The community began talking about the case, and that uncontrolled spread of information risked contaminating statements as witnesses inadvertently adjusted their memories to match what they heard from others or local media. This forced Wilmington PD to act quickly in recording and locking in statements to minimize distortion over time. Even so, the overall picture still lacked a clear anchor. Leads about strangers and suspicious vehicles did not converge enough to pinpoint a specific direction of movement. Contradictions in statements made accurately reconstructing the disappearance window increasingly difficult, and every passing hour reduced the ability to extract fresh information from witnesses as memories faded and confidence in accounts waned. For the investigators, this phase was not only a race against time, but a test of distinguishing useful information from noise, between details that could lead to a breakthrough, and factors merely reflecting the chaos of a community reeling from a major shock. The inconsistency of the statements was not a sign that the case was unsolvable, but it posed a significant barrier, forcing Wilmington PD to acknowledge that without additional objective data, relying solely on witnesses to trace Anthony Alexander would become increasingly ineffective, and that realization gradually fostered a sense of unease within the investigation, as they clearly saw the limits of what could be achieved from human accounts alone in a disappearance that left no clear trace. Given that witness statements were not consistent enough to establish a clear tracing direction, Wilmington PD had to shift focus to a more systematic investigative axis, screening suspects based on relationships and histories that could be directly or indirectly linked to Anthony Alexander. The first step targeted people closely familiar with the family, including relatives, friends, neighbors with regular contact, and anyone who had been alone with Anthony in the period before he vanished. Investigators conducted detailed interviews with each subject, not only to verify whereabouts on the day of the incident, but also to assess potential motives, emotional, financial, or personal conflicts that could lead to unusual behavior. However, results from this phase yielded no clear signs of direct involvement, Most screened individuals had relatively solid alibis or no history of suspicious behavior, and in a small community, where relationships overlapped, finding someone with a motive strong enough to cause Anthony's disappearance proved harder than expected. When the known acquaintances' direction produced no breakthrough, Wilmington PD expanded to reviewing individuals with prior sexual offense records in the area and nearby regions, a sensitive but necessary step, reflecting the growing recognition that if adult intervention was involved, the possibility of a person with a history of child abuse could not be ignored. The list was pulled from local records, covering those residing within a radius that allowed quick access to the Alexander family's neighborhood. Each file was examined thoroughly, from criminal history and release conditions to travel restrictions and daily activities. Investigators cross-referenced this information with the established timeline to determine whether any subject could not reasonably account for their location during the disappearance window. However, the process quickly exposed inherent limitations of the era's system. Sexual offender data were not widely interconnected across jurisdictions, records were unevenly updated, and many listed individuals had changed residences or were no longer closely monitored. Alibi verification thus relied heavily on statements and indirect evidence such as work schedules, confirmations from acquaintances, or presence at public locations. For some subjects, alibis were convincing enough to rule them out, while for others the information was neither clear enough to exclude, nor weak enough to justify charges, creating a legal gray area that prevented police from advancing further. Alongside reviewing registered offenders, Wilmington PD also cross-checked records of individuals previously reported for suspicious behavior around children, even if never convicted, a step to ensure no possibility was overlooked, though it increased workload and screening complexity, as every potential suspect required careful handling to avoid privacy violations and unfounded accusations. Investigators had to balance the urgency to act quickly with legal responsibility to base conclusions only on verifiable evidence. As each file was compared against the timeline and existing facts, one reality became clear: no suspect combined the necessary elements to become a criminal prosecution target. Some were eliminated due to clear alibis, others for lacking access to the area during the disappearance window, and the remainder for having no motive or connection to the victim's family. This necessary elimination process exposed a troubling gap: the possibility that Anthony had been taken by someone not on any existing list, an individual with no recorded criminal history, and no ties to the family's known network. An impasse in criminal pursuit began to form as investigators realized that every initial screening direction led to a dead end. The absence of physical evidence, reliable witnesses, and consistency in statements provided no legal basis to detain or deeply interrogate any suspect. Each elimination decision followed the principle of caution, but as they accumulated, they created a sense that the case was slipping beyond the control of traditional investigation. In that context, Wilmington PD faced a difficult question: had they missed a critical detail in the early stage, or did the nature of the incident fall outside familiar patterns of child disappearances? That question had no clear answer at the time, but it reflected an internal shift in perception, from expecting a suspect to emerge soon to acknowledging that the case might be far more complex and harder to resolve than initially envisioned. When the initial suspect screening temporarily concluded without concrete results, the criminal pursuit impasse was not only an investigative state, but a psychological burden weighing on both the police force and the victim's family. Because every day without progress reduced the chances of gathering further evidence and made the hope of finding Anthony safe increasingly fragile. And it was in that moment that Wilmington PD had to admit that the investigative tools available to them, though used comprehensively in the early phase, were still insufficient to break the deadlock gradually forming around Anthony Alexander's disappearance. After the initial suspect screening process yielded no credible individuals to pursue criminally, Wilmington PD was forced to confront the reality that the first 3 days since Anthony Alexander's disappearance had passed in a series of efforts that produced no breakthrough, and that very passage of time exposed clear misalignments in the initial approach. As most resources in the first 72 hours were poured into safer assumptions, such as the possibility of the child wandering off or moving spontaneously within the neighborhood, while less common but more dangerous scenarios were not prioritized to a commensurate degree. The expanding radius searches continued, but lacked specific guidance from verified clues, causing many areas to be repeatedly swept, while other potential routes of movement were not checked in time. This dispersion of resources did not stem from a lack of responsibility, but from the absence of strong enough data to force the investigation to lean fully in one direction. Yet the consequence was that precious time was consumed while the window of opportunity to gather hot information steadily narrowed. When initial leads were not reinforced with physical evidence or reliable testimony, they quickly lost value over time. Vague reports of strangers and suspicious vehicles could not be verified while still fresh, leading to the probability of tracing related individuals or vehicles becoming nearly zero. In a context without modern data systems for quick storage and cross-referencing, every passing hour reduced the ability to recover traces of what might have happened in the disappearance window, and as the second day, and then the third day arrived, investigators began to realize that most of the highest value leads had gone cold, witness memories faded, confidence in statements diminished, and details that were already inconsistent became even harder to verify. Evidence collection was also directly impacted by the passage of time. Search areas, though sealed off to a certain extent, could not maintain their original state amid normal community activity. Potential traces were obscured by footsteps, passing vehicles and environmental conditions, while the scant physical evidence discovered was insufficient to lead to specific investigative actions. This caused the overall effectiveness of evidence collection to decline markedly, and each additional effort became more preventive than directly persuasive. The stagnation in the investigation did not occur suddenly, but formed gradually through each cautious decision, as investigators were forced to admit that there were few immediate action options left beyond continuing to re-examine already tested hypotheses, but repeating steps that yielded no results also meant consuming more time without increasing the probability of finding Anthony. Within the investigative team, a sense of deadlock began to spread, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of means to convert effort into progress. Coordination meetings increasingly focused on reassessing what had been done, rather than outlining new directions, and this shift reflected a hard-to-accept reality. The case was gradually moving out of the initial emergency phase, without achieving the core goal of locating the victim. For the Alexander family, the first 72 hours were not just a period of waiting, but a series of harsh psychological experiences, from hope that Anthony would soon be found nearby to growing fear, as each passing hour brought no new news. They witnessed the search activity unfolding continuously before their eyes, but could not understand why all those efforts still led to no answers. The presence of police, volunteers, and local media initially provided a sense of support, but as time dragged on without results, it gradually became a painful reminder that Anthony had not been found. This psychological pressure manifested not only in fatigue and exhaustion, but also in guilt, as the family questioned small decisions made on the day of the incident. Moments of hesitation or complacency recalled with increasing severity. Meanwhile, the investigators also faced similar pressure but in a different form. They had to balance the responsibility to continue acting with the reality that available investigative tools were gradually losing effectiveness. Each decision to stop or continue a search direction carried psychological consequences, as it meant accepting that some possibilities might have been missed. The failure in the first 72 hours was not the result of a single mistake, but the combination of many factors, from technological limitations, lack of objective data, to initial assumptions typical of the era, all combining to create a picture in which the case could not be resolved quickly as expected. When the emergency phase ended without clear progress, the investigation began shifting to a holding pattern. not because efforts stopped entirely, but because the pace was no longer driven by hot leads. Each subsequent day required more effort to maintain attention and resources, while the probability of obtaining new information continued to decline. This change marked a significant turning point in the case, where the failure of the first 72 hours not only reduced the chances of finding Anthony in the short term, but also laid the foundation for a longer period of uncertainty, where both the family and the investigative team had to learn to face a new reality. Anthony Alexander's disappearance was no longer a short-term emergency, but had become a complex puzzle, requiring patience, endurance, and acceptance that the answer, if it existed, would not come quickly. When the emergency phase concluded without bringing any strong enough leads to push the investigation further, Wilmington PD was forced to adjust its strategy to the reality of limited resources. Wide-area search activities were gradually scaled back. The number of officers directly involved in the case decreased to prioritize new emergencies arising in the city. The reduction in resources did not happen abruptly, but in small steps, starting with ending large-scale community searches, then reducing the frequency of field sweeps, until only a small team of investigators maintained minimal file monitoring. This decision did not reflect abandonment of the case, but was a consequence of no longer having new data to act on. In a context where each passing day without additional information reduced the ability to find Anthony Alexander using traditional methods. Along with scaling back field activities, the case file began to be systematized for long-term storage. All interview transcripts, search maps, scene reports, and internal analyses were reorganized chronologically, shifting from continuous processing to preservation status. For many officers involved in the initial phase, this was a symbolic step marking the case's change, because once the file was moved to storage, it meant it was no longer a top priority in the daily workload, though nominally, the case remained open and ready to be reactivated if new leads emerged. In this process, investigative personnel changes also occurred naturally with work cycles. Officers who had directly participated in the initial searches were reassigned to other duties, retired or transferred units, and Anthony Alexander's case was gradually handed over to investigators without direct memory of those intense early days. Each handover carried the risk of losing tacit information, impressions, sensations, and inferences, not fully documented in the official file. Though the reports still existed, the initial urgency and emotional context could not be fully conveyed, making the case increasingly abstract, viewed through paperwork rather than real experience. As time passed, the lack of a breakthrough became an undeniable reality. All main hypotheses had been tested within the limits allowed by existing evidence. Leads once considered promising led to no concrete results, and no new reports were reliable enough to restart large-scale searches. Within Wilmington PD, the case began to be referred to as an unsolved one, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of data. This change in terminology reflected a shift in perception, from expecting quick resolution to accepting that this was a case that could drag on for years without clear progress. For Anthony's family, the case gradually going cold was not an administrative decision, but a painful experience. They clearly felt the difference as police visits dwindled, phone calls became rarer, and update inquiries about progress grew sparse. Though officially the case was never closed, in daily life its presence in public space and in the law enforcement system's priorities had declined significantly, creating a growing gap between the family's ongoing pain and the normal rhythm of the surrounding society. From an investigative perspective, the case turning into a cold case carried long-term consequences. On one hand, it allowed the file to be preserved for future review when conditions changed. On the other, it also meant that nearly all active search efforts stopped, leaving only passive waiting for an external factor, such as a late confession, a chance discovery, or a new technology not yet existing at the time. Investigators understood that as time dragged on, the ability to collect physical evidence became nearly zero. Witnesses died or no longer remembered details clearly, and any involved parties, if they existed, had more opportunities to change identities or life circumstances. When the case was officially considered cold, it no longer appeared in priority meetings or performance reports, but it still existed as a ripple in the system, an unclosed file, ready to be reopened if there was valid reason. This status reflected the limits of investigative work in the context of that era's technology and data, where not every missing person case could be solved through effort and experience, but sometimes required accepting temporary helplessness before unfillable gaps. The cooling of Anthony Alexander's case was not an end but a prolonged pause, in which elements once central gradually faded from collective memory, leaving only a marked file, a name on the list of unsolved missing children, and a family that had to learn to live with uncertainty, while the investigative system moved on to new priorities, leaving this case in a state of waiting, where hope existed but was no longer driven by concrete action, and that very moment marked Anthony Alexander's case, officially entering the cold case phase, not by a public announcement, but by the spreading silence in both investigative activity and the community's daily life. While Anthony Alexander's file gradually sank into silence in Wilmington PD's storage system, the life of the 7-year-old boy from that time did not stop, but continued under a completely different form, in a place unconnected to the name Alexander, and bearing no public traces of the 1972 disappearance. Anthony grew up with a new name, a legally recognized identity, with documents, school records, medical history, and life milestones that seemed normal like any other child. From the outside, there were no signs that this man had once been the center of an urgent search decades earlier. His personal records were built fully according to administrative standards, sufficient for him to study, work, travel, and integrate into society, without any legal obstacles. But that very completeness concealed a larger void, the absence of information about his true origins. In official documents, the parts related to birthplace and biological family were not specific, stopping at the minimum information needed to legalize the identity, with no extended data, no clear links to relatives, and none of the details typically seen in the records of a child born and raised in a family with a clear history. As Anthony grew older and began forming self-awareness, small inconsistencies in his identity appeared quietly, not large enough to cause immediate suspicion, but enough to create a sense of misalignment. Questions about origins received no specific answers. Gaps in the family story were not filled with memories or photos, and important childhood milestones were not tied to a clear context. All of this existed alongside an outwardly stable life, making the identity Anthony carried both legal and fragile, legal on paper but fragile in the continuity of his life story. The existence of an alternate identity was not just carrying a different name, but living in a rebuilt narrative, where early memories were severed from their original context, biological connections replaced by new social relationships, and questions about origins set aside as unnecessary for survival. Over time, Anthony learned to accept the identity given to him, not because it was fully convincing, but because it was the only foundation for continuing life without being placed in uncertainty. However, even as an adult, the feeling of lacking origins persisted as a faint underlayer, not always clearly present, but enough to make small details hard to explain, such as the lack of clear resemblance to those around him in his current family, or the inability to trace family history back through generations as society typically assumes. That alternate identity functioned effectively in administrative and social life, but it could not provide answers to fundamental questions about oneself, and the separation between these two aspects created a unique state of existence, where Anthony was both a complete individual in the present and an information-lacking piece in the past. From this perspective, the 1972 disappearance was no longer a cold file in storage, but the starting point of a chain of consequences lasting decades, directly affecting how a person formed and understood themselves. The absence of origin information was not seen as an urgent issue for most of Anthony's life. because the legal identity he carried was sufficient to meet all societal requirements, but it still existed as a latent abnormality, a mismatched detail in the personal structure, and looking back from this angle, it can be seen that Anthony Alexander's disappearance not only created a void in the investigative file, but also created a parallel life, where a missing child continued to exist in a different form, with a different name, and with a story built to replace the one that had been severed. That identity was not a forgery in the legal sense, but it was a substitution in the existential sense, reflecting how a person could be placed on a completely different trajectory from just one moment of disappearance, and for many years afterward, the existence of this alternate identity proceeded quietly, unsuspected, unchallenged, and completely detached from the cold case file still lying dormant in Wilmington PD's system. The substitute identity that Anthony carried from a young age not only shaped the way he presented himself to society, but also profoundly influenced the structure of his childhood memories. Those memories did not vanish entirely, but existed in a fragmented, disordered form, unanchored to a continuous timeline. In the early years that should have been secured by clear images of family, the first home or familiar milestones, Anthony had only intermittent fragments of memory, vague sensations without specific context. There were moments familiar to the point of being inexplicable, yet impossible to place within a complete narrative. These memories were not strong enough to serve as evidence for anything, yet not weak enough to disappear altogether. They lingered like faint smudges beyond the reach of precise naming. The lack of connection to his biological family was the central factor creating this state, because while other children grew up with a clear network of biological relationships, where personal memories were reinforced by relative stories, old photographs, and family traditions, Anthony had no such anchor, no adult who could recount his earliest years to him, no relatives to compare similarities or differences with, and no intergenerational family history passed down. This absence was not merely a lack of information, but a lack of structure for organizing memories, causing early experiences, even if they existed, to find no stable place in his awareness. Without a clear family history, Anthony grew up with a personal story abruptly cut off at the beginning. Everything before a certain point was vague or entirely blank. In ordinary social situations, filling out personal information forms, hearing friends talk about their ancestors, or being asked about family origins, he had to rely on generic details or those pre-provided in his records. Such information was sufficient to complete procedures, but not enough to create a sense of belonging. Over time, this deficiency did not manifest as an overt crisis, but accumulated into a prolonged state, where questions about himself were set aside because there was no way to answer them, yet they did not vanish because they were tied to the fundamental sense of who he was. These enduring personal voids became part of his inner life, not always on the surface, but influencing how Anthony viewed relationships and himself. While he could integrate, study, and work like others, the feeling of lacking a solid foundation made it hard for him to connect deeply with others' family stories, because each encounter with the continuity in others' memories made the discontinuity in his own more apparent. This state did not lead to extreme manifestations, but created a subtle difference, an invisible distance between Anthony and those whose personal histories had been built continuously from birth. That discontinuous childhood also affected how he remembered and interpreted events in his life. Memories from after the early period were often recorded more carefully, as if he unconsciously tried to compensate for the missing part by holding tighter to what came later. However, no matter the effort, the beginning of the story could not be recreated from within, because it lacked original data, lacked witnesses, and lacked the context for those scattered memory fragments to connect on their own. For many years, these voids were not seen as a problem needing resolution, because Anthony's life proceeded normally by all external standards. He had a legal identity, an educational history, social relationships, and the ability to shape his own future. But on a deeper level, that discontinuous childhood created a form of prolonged silence, where questions about origins, the earliest years, and biological ties were not raised publicly, but always present as an underlying layer. And it was this layer that made Anthony's life story, though smooth on the surface, missing an irreplaceable part, the part that by common expectation should be the starting point of any personal identity. This absence was not a sudden tragedy, but a prolonged condition, quietly shaping how a person exists in the world, carrying an unclear past, a discontinuous childhood, and a personal story that begins midway without an opening chapter for reference. From the foundation of a discontinuous childhood and enduring gaps in personal memory, the anomalies in Anthony's paperwork and records gradually emerged as details that could not be entirely overlooked, because when placed side by side, they formed a pattern of inconsistency, difficult to explain solely by ordinary administrative carelessness. The birth certificate was the starting point of this chain of questions, a legally valid document, but containing unusually minimal information. No expanded data about the medical facility of birth, no clear traces of biological relatives beyond the required fields, and no accompanying supporting documents, typically seen in the records of a child born and registered through standard procedures. This deficiency was not enough to invalidate the document's legal value, but it created a sense of emptiness when compared to other records from the same period, where origin details were usually recorded more fully. As Anthony grew up and administrative records continued to accumulate over time, the inconsistencies became clearer. The history of movements in his early years did not form a logical straight line. Changes in residence occurred in short periods without clear explanations for the reasons, unlinked to common events like job transfers or family structure changes. These geographic jumps were formalized on paper, but lacked corresponding social context, making them appear more like administrative adjustments than the natural result of continuous living. Alongside this was the near-complete absence of childhood photographs and documents. While most families retain at least some images, preschool records, or initial medical papers, Anthony's file contained only data that appeared later, as if the early years had been skipped in the archiving process. This shortage caused no obstacle to daily administrative procedures, but it made tracing back personal history nearly impossible, because there were no visual artifacts for comparison, no original documents to confirm the continuity of a life story. When these details were examined individually, each could be explained by various reasons, from lax past archiving systems to personal circumstances not fully recorded, but when viewed together, a pattern began to form: the existence of a legal record lacking depth, an identity built to meet the system's minimum requirements, but without the layers of information typically present in a naturally formed personhood from birth. Details difficult to verify appeared increasingly when attempting to trace back key milestones, old addresses that no longer existed or had no archived records, facilities once noted in documents, but leaving no clear trace, and individuals involved in the early period who could not be identified or had vanished from public management systems. All this made verification objectively limited, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of independently verifiable data. Doubts about the legal origin of Anthony's identity did not arise as a specific accusation, but as a lingering question, increasingly hard to ignore as anomalies accumulated: the question of whether this identity was formed through a standard process, or merely the result of a series of administrative decisions to legitimize an unclear situation. In the societal context of decades earlier, when oversight mechanisms were lax and cross-jurisdictional data comparison was virtually non-existent, the possibility of an identity being constructed with minimal scrutiny was plausible, and that very possibility made the anomalies in Anthony's records more noteworthy. Notably, for a long time, these irregularities were not sufficient to trigger any formal review process, because functionally, the documents remained valid and met system requirements. Society operates on the legality of records, rather than the completeness of the story behind them. Thus, Anthony's identity continued unchallenged, with doubts existing only at the personal level, as mismatched feelings he could not articulate or turn into concrete action. However, that prolonged silence highlighted an important reality. The anomalies in the paperwork did not fade over time, but were merely buried under the smooth operation of administrative life. And when viewing the entire record structure holistically, it became clear that this identity, though legal, was built on a foundation lacking solidity and origins, a foundation that, if closely examined, would raise questions not only about Anthony himself, but about how the system allowed a life story to be shaped without full verification from the start. In that context, the anomalies were no longer random details but important pieces suggesting that behind a seemingly complete record might lie a different truth, unrecognized, unnamed, but silently present in every line of paperwork for many years. The anomalies in Anthony's paperwork only truly gained meaning when placed in the broader context of the U.S. adoption system in the 1970s, a transitional period marked by legal and oversight laxity, when processes were primarily managed by individual states, with low standardization and very limited federal intervention. At that time, child adoptions were not coordinated through a unified database. There was no mandatory mechanism for cross-checking information across jurisdictions, and no strict requirement to verify a child's biological origins in every case. Formally legal adoptions could be completed with just basic paperwork, especially in private adoptions where parties dealt directly without involving state child welfare agencies. This absence of federal oversight created an environment where verification responsibility depended almost entirely on local capacity and diligence, while evaluation criteria and record-keeping were inconsistent, leading many adoptions to be handled as pure administrative procedures rather than decisions requiring long-term follow-up. For children without clear birth records, or presented as orphans, abandoned, or from hard-to-verify circumstances, the system often prioritized quick stabilization over thorough origin tracing, as the primary goal was to place the child in a deemed suitable family environment, even with incomplete input information. In that context, informal adoptions became not uncommon, including unofficial agreements between individuals, between adoptive families, and unlicensed intermediaries, or involving cross-state moves to complete procedures in jurisdictions with looser legal requirements. Such cases could be legitimized with minimal paperwork, creating a legal identity for the child, but without ensuring origin transparency. This did not mean all informal adoptions were illegal, but it opened the possibility that children removed from their original environments were not always protected by necessary controls. Linking these characteristics to Anthony's records, the possibility of legitimizing a kidnapping through the era's lax adoption system was no longer a far-fetched hypothesis, because if a child was presented as having no relatives or entered the process with an unfully verified origin story, creating a new birth certificate or substitute identity file was feasible without major barriers, especially given the lack of interstate coordination and no national database to cross-reference missing children with adopted ones. This separation between the missing persons system and the welfare adoption system created a gap that, if exploited, could allow a child to disappear from one state's records and legally reappear elsewhere under a new identity. Limitations in accessing old records further exacerbated this, as many 1970s documents were not digitized, were scattered in storage, or lost over time. Tracing back administrative decisions, identifying intermediaries, or clarifying applied procedures in specific cases became extremely difficult after decades. Even with suspicions, proving a particular adoption involved kidnapping was nearly beyond traditional investigative methods, without direct evidence or testimony from surviving involved parties. In this context, Anthony's story reflected a systemic vulnerability rather than an isolated incident, where processes designed for humanitarian goals lacked necessary safeguards against abuse. The existence of a legal, but Origen's shallow identity became not just a personal issue, but a sign of how a system could inadvertently facilitate erasing traces of a child taken from their biological family. This was especially notable in that era's society, when awareness of child trafficking and kidnapping for adoption purposes was not widely discussed or seen as a common risk. In retrospect, the 1970s adoption system's loopholes cannot be judged solely by modern standards, but placing them alongside Anthony's records shows that lack of oversight, interconnection, and data retrievability created an environment where a missing child could dissolve into the administrative machinery without clear traces. And in that environment, Anthony's substitute identity could be formed, persist, and endure for years undetected, not because there was no wrongdoing, but because there was no mechanism strong enough to reconnect the scattered pieces, making the boundary between legal adoption and legitimized kidnapping so fragile that it could only be recognized when viewing the full picture from a sufficient temporal distance. The systemic loopholes of the 1970s that once allowed a missing child to vanish from the reach of investigative agencies also established another reality. Over time, that very system changed in unpredictable ways, and those changes created entirely new conditions for files that seemed destined to fade into oblivion, to be revisited through a different lens. It began with the transformation in criminal investigation technology, where methods relying purely on witness statements, physical evidence from the scene, and human memory were gradually supplemented and then replaced by tools for data analysis, digital storage, and automated cross-referencing. These advances did not happen overnight, but accumulated over decades, yet by the end of the 20th century, they were powerful enough to fundamentally alter how old cases were approached. One of the most foundational changes was the creation and expansion of federal databases, which allowed information previously fragmented across states, counties, and agencies to be centralized and accessed collectively. For missing children cases, this meant that files were no longer confined to the local jurisdiction where the incident occurred, but could be compared and cross-referenced with national data, from missing children lists to other civil records. This interconnectivity broke one of the biggest barriers in earlier investigations, information isolation, where a child could disappear in one state and reappear in another without leaving any connecting trace in the system. Alongside this, the way records were stored and retrieved also changed. Paper documents were gradually digitized, making it far more feasible to review thousands of pages of old files. Details once buried in storage cabinets could now be searched, compared, and analyzed systematically. This not only saved time, but also reduced reliance on the individual memories of investigators, which were vulnerable to loss as personnel changed over generations. However, the factor with the greatest potential to turn old cases around was not improvements to traditional methods, but the emergence of an entirely new field in investigation: genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic DNA testing, which is only effective with a direct reference sample, genetic genealogy allows indirect biological connections to be built through distant relatives, opening the possibility of identifying individuals even when no prior information exists about the person being sought. This method leverages the growth of consumer DNA databases, where millions of people voluntarily submit samples to explore their ancestry, inadvertently creating a vast biological network that can be used to trace individuals of unknown origin. The arrival of genetic genealogy completely changed the approach to cold cases because it does not require knowing in advance where the victim is or what identity they are using. Instead, it starts with a biological sample and follows genetic relationships to progressively narrow the search circle. For cases like Anthony's, where the current legal identity exists but the biological origin is obscured, this technology created an investigative path that had never existed before, one that does not depend on human memory, is not limited by administrative boundaries, and is not affected by the loss of paper records. When these factors converged, the change was not only in tools but in investigative mindset. Law enforcement agencies began to re-evaluate the value of old files, no longer viewing them as cases exhausted of leads, but as unsolved puzzles that lacked the right technical conditions at the time they were first investigated. This shift led to the re-examination of numerous long-dormant missing persons cases, especially those involving children, where the possibility that the victim was still alive and living under a different identity was no longer considered far-fetched. For the Anthony Alexander file, the emergence of these new conditions held special significance because it directly addressed the weaknesses that had previously stalled the case: the lack of data interconnectivity, the inability to trace across states, and the impossibility of verifying biological origin. All of these could now be revisited in the light of modern technology, not by repeating what had failed in the past, but by asking entirely different questions, questions that previously had no way to be answered. The new opportunities for old cases did not come from a single discovery, but from the accumulation of many parallel changes. As technology, data, and investigative thinking evolved together, they created an environment where gaps once thought permanent could be re-examined, and identities that had existed beyond the system's reach could be reconnected to their biological origins. In that context, a case that had gone cold for decades was no longer entirely dependent on the randomness of a confession or an accidental discovery, but could be proactively reactivated using new tools that allowed the system to look back at the very limitations that had once rendered it powerless. And it was this fundamental change that opened the possibility that the story of Anthony Alexander, once frozen in an era of paper files and fragile memories, could be placed back on the investigative table with an entirely different set of questions and means. From the new conditions formed by modern technology and investigative thinking, the Anthony Alexander file, for the first time in decades, had the chance to be approached in a completely different way, and the pivotal step began with the boy's biological family, people who had lived with uncertainty for years, and were now asked to participate in a process that did not exist when Anthony disappeared, providing DNA samples for biological comparison. This decision was not merely a technical procedure, but an acceptance of reopening a door that seemed permanently closed, because submitting DNA meant facing the past again, confronting both the possibility of hope and the possibility of disappointment. Yet in a context where every other path had reached its limit, it became the only choice that could produce real change. When the DNA samples from the biological family were collected under standard protocol, they were coded and entered into modern analysis systems, where biological data no longer existed as isolated sequences, but became part of a vast comparison network. This system allowed DNA to be matched, not only directly but also against millions of other profiles, through indirect genetic relationships, something previously impossible. Entering the data did not yield immediate results, but occurred in a state of cautious waiting, because investigators knew that most cases do not produce clear matches, and each negative result meant another door of hope closing. However, in this case, the system began registering noteworthy signals, not an immediate direct match, but results showing a certain degree of biological connection between the Alexander family samples and an individual existing in the database under a completely different identity. These signals were initially classified as requiring further verification, because genetic genealogy works on probability and compatibility levels. Not every match is conclusive. Investigators conducted deeper analysis to assess whether this connection fit the hypothesis that Anthony was still alive and living under a different identity. Evaluating the degree of compatibility became a complex process requiring the combination of biological analysis and cross-referencing of personal records. DNA experts examined match ratios, the closeness of genetic relationships, and the ability to explain the results through various scenarios, while investigators compared age, timelines, and geographic factors of the individual suggested by the system with the 1972 missing person file. Each data point was placed side by side to rule out random coincidence or confusion with unrelated cases. This process did not unfold in excitement, but under tight control, because errors at this stage could lead to serious legal and psychological consequences for all parties involved. When initial analysis showed compatibility exceeding normal thresholds, the possibility that Anthony Alexander was still alive was no longer a speculative hypothesis, but a scenario that needed serious consideration. This marked a significant turning point in how the file was viewed, because for the first time since the case went cold, there was objective data, independent of witness memory or scene evidence, suggesting the victim's fate. This change reversed the traditional investigative order, where the question was no longer where Anthony went in the early days after disappearing, but how he had lived all that time, and under what identity. Although the match was not yet sufficient for a final conclusion, it forced investigators to re-evaluate all old assumptions, from abduction and off-system adoption to the creation of a new legal identity. All the loopholes previously analyzed now ceased to be isolated inferences and began connecting through a common point: biological data. DNA became the bridge between a missing child in paper files and an adult existing in the real world, a bridge that could not be denied by argument or speculation. Within the case team, the discovery of the match created a state of both caution and tension, because it opened the possibility of resolving a decades-old case, but also imposed the responsibility to verify every detail thoroughly before any information was officially confirmed. Investigators understood that each next step required absolute precision, not only to ensure the legality of the conclusion, but also to protect the people on both sides of the story: the biological family that had waited too long, and the individual living under a different identity, who might be completely unaware of their biological connection. The possibility that Anthony was alive, once dismissed as fanciful for years, was now grounded in scientific data, not as a certain promise, but as a door opened wide enough to allow the investigation to proceed. This changed the nature of the case from an unsolved missing person file to a biological identification puzzle to be solved with modern methods. That change was not only technical but symbolic, because it showed how time, instead of burying the truth, sometimes creates conditions for the truth to be approached in ways the past did not allow. When the DNA turning point was recorded in the file, it did not close the story, but raised a series of new questions, each tied to the next verification step that needed to be carried out carefully. In that context, the Anthony Alexander case, for the first time in decades, escaped passive waiting, no longer dependent on chance or a late confession, but guided by a verifiable chain of data. And from that point, the investigation entered a completely different phase, where the possibility of finding the victim was no longer an assumption, but a specific goal to be pursued with means that had never existed before. From the DNA turning point just established, the next process was no longer searching in the dark, but shifted to a phase of rigorous verification, where every piece of data had to be weighed to confirm or rule out the possibility of random coincidence. The case team's first task was matching age and timeline, because this is a basic but decisive criterion. Experts compared the estimated birth year of the individual with the alternate identity to the time Anthony Alexander disappeared in 1972, checking whether the current age was compatible with the hypothesis that they were the same person. This process did not stop at the birth year on paper, but also considered indirect factors such as developmental stages, educational milestones, and biological markers consistent with actual age. Because in cases of reconstructed identity, the birth year could be adjusted within a certain range to fit circumstances, the matching showed no significant discrepancy large enough to rule out the possibility that the two identities were one, and that was sufficient for the hypothesis to remain rather than be rejected outright. Alongside the timeline factor, geographic matching was implemented as the next verification layer. Investigators reviewed the residence history of the individual suggested by the DNA system, cross-referencing places of living, movement, and long-term settlement with areas accessible from Wilmington in the period after 1972. The goal of this step was not to find a specific travel route, but to determine the overall feasibility of the scenario, whether a child missing in Delaware could legally appear in those locations without contradicting the social and legal context of that era. The results showed that the geographic markers did not exclude each other. There were no distances or administrative barriers that made the hypothesis implausible, especially in the context of off-system adoptions and interstate movement that were loosely monitored in the 1970s. Once age and geography were confirmed as compatible, the focus shifted to comparing personal records, a far more complex step because it required placing two life stories side by side. One, the missing person file of Anthony Alexander, frozen since 1972, and the other, the fully built administrative record of an adult, lacking depth and origin. Investigators analyzed every milestone in the current record, from identification documents, educational history, medical records, to social relationships, looking for gaps or anomalies that could be explained by an identity change. Early years lacking documentation, unverifiable origin information, and the late appearance of personal records were viewed in the context of the hypothesis that Anthony was alive, and when seen through this lens, anomalies that had previously existed in isolation began connecting into a more coherent structure. A critical requirement at this stage was ruling out random coincidence, because genetic genealogy relies on probability and indirect genetic relationships. Not every match leads to the same specific individual. To achieve this, biology experts ran simulations of alternative scenarios, examining whether the DNA compatibility level could be explained by distant unrelated kinship, while investigators checked whether any other individual in the database fit the biological connection better. This exclusion process was carried out meticulously. Each possibility was considered and eliminated based on specific data to ensure the final conclusion was not based on mere statistical coincidence, but on a converging chain of evidence. As random coincidence possibilities were gradually eliminated, the identity hypothesis was strengthened by the combination of multiple data layers. DNA no longer stood alone, but was supported by compatibility in age, timeline, geography, and personal record structure. Each factor individually might not have been enough for a conclusion, but together they formed a consistent pattern where the likelihood that Anthony Alexander and the individual with the alternate identity were the same person became more reasonable than any alternative scenario. This did not mean the conclusion was officially confirmed, but it marked an important shift from suspicion to high probability, from a hypothesis to be considered to one that needed to be proven conclusively. Within the case team, the DNA match verification phase was regarded as the ultimate test of the entire process's rigor, because a single unexplained contradiction in any data layer could collapse the whole hypothesis. Therefore, investigators did not try to rush progress but focused on continuous cross-checking, ensuring every interim conclusion could withstand independent review. This process took time not only due to the large volume of data, but also because the consequences of an error at this stage would directly affect people who had lived with the case's fallout for decades. As matching and exclusion gradually concluded, the identity hypothesis was no longer an abstract possibility, but became the central axis of the file. All new data was evaluated based on whether it strengthened or weakened this hypothesis, and in a context where no factor could negate the established compatibility, the investigation entered a new state where the question was no longer whether Anthony Alexander was alive, but how to confirm it officially and legally. This shift reflected the success of the verification phase, where DNA not only opened the door but withstood the strictest challenges, allowing the identity hypothesis to advance a long step from possibility to near certainty. though still requiring one final confirmation to close the scientific and legal verification loop. From the moment the identity hypothesis was reinforced through multiple layers of verification without any negating factors emerging, the Anthony Alexander case officially moved beyond dormant file status and forced the investigative system to reactivate it under a completely different structure than in 1972. The first step was the decision to establish a dedicated cold case investigative team consisting of investigators experienced in handling long-standing cases, forensic experts, data analysts, and legal advisors. This team's responsibilities went beyond merely verifying identity. They also had to reevaluate the entire past investigation in light of the new data. Reopening the case was not viewed as a simple continuation, but as a new investigation built on the old foundation, with higher demands for systematization, transparency, and the ability to withstand the highest level of legal scrutiny. One of the team's top priorities was to digitize all documents related to the 1972 disappearance, from scene reports, witness statements, and search maps to handwritten internal notes that had been stored separately over decades. This process served not only to preserve the data, but also to enable modern tools to make searching, cross-referencing, and analysis feasible. Once paper documents were converted to digital format, details previously buried in thousands of pages could be reorganized by timeline, location, or involved parties, allowing the team to identify connections that had been impossible to detect due to earlier limitations in information processing. In parallel with digitization, the team conducted a comprehensive review of all leads recorded in the initial phase, excluding no detail simply because it had once been deemed unimportant. Every witness statement, every report of a stranger or suspicious vehicle, every investigative decision made in the first 72 hours was re-examined, not to immediately find a new direction, but to assess whether any detail, when placed in the context of the hypothesis that Anthony was alive and had been taken, might carry a different meaning than it had at the time. This process required immense patience and discipline, as the greatest risk in reopening a case is carelessly imposing current conclusions on past facts. As the leads were reviewed, the team began reconstructing the entire sequence of events from the beginning, not limited to the day Anthony disappeared, but including the prior context and developments immediately after the case went cold. This sequence was built as an expanded timeline in which every decision, every lapse in oversight, and every system response was placed in its proper position. The goal was not to identify who was wrong, but to understand why certain choices were made, given the constraints of that era, and how those choices influenced the case's trajectory in the years that followed. Reconstructing the sequence also enabled the team to more clearly identify breaking points in the initial handling, moments when the case might have taken a different turn if additional data had been available, or if the abduction hypothesis had been prioritized earlier. Rather than viewing these as mistakes, however, the team treated them as structural factors that needed to be properly understood to avoid repetition in similar cases and to clarify how the system had operated under conditions of limited technology, poor interconnectivity, and different societal pressures than today. As the overall picture became clearer, the team began defining new investigative directions suited to the available data. Unlike previous phases, these directions no longer focused on searching for the victim in physical space, but on verifying identity, tracing backward the formation of the substitute identity, and clarifying the administrative mechanisms that had allowed it to occur. The new direction was built on the assumption that Anthony had not vanished from society, but only from the missing persons records. Thus the focus shifted from what happened to the boy, to how was the boy inserted into a different system. In this process, interagency coordination became key, as reopening the case required involvement not only from local police, but also federal agencies, civil records repositories, and organizations with authority over child welfare and adoption. Every step had to be carefully considered to ensure that gathering new information did not violate the privacy rights of the person living under the other identity, while still meeting legal requirements for use in subsequent verification stages. Reopening the case also brought a psychological shift within the investigative team, from precautionary caution to controlled proactivity. The team understood they stood on the verge of resolving a decades-old case, but also knew that any rushed step could cause irreversible harm, not only to the case, but to the people involved. This balance was maintained through strict internal protocols, requiring every conclusion to be supported by multiple independent data sources before entering the official record. As new investigative directions were established and necessary resources mobilized, the Anthony Alexander case entered a phase entirely different from any before it. No longer a file awaiting random leads, but a clearly directed investigation grounded in scientific data and information connectivity that the past had not allowed. This reopening held not only technical significance, but symbolic meaning for how the investigative system could confront its own past limitations, using new tools to re-ask old questions and thereby create opportunities for stories interrupted long ago to be responsibly and accurately resumed. From the moment the dedicated investigative team had established a clear approach based on biological data and the reconstructed case file, the next critical step was no longer inference or indirect analysis, but direct identity confirmation through DNA comparison. This was the most sensitive phase of the entire process, as it marked the boundary between a well-founded hypothesis and legal truth. Direct comparative DNA sampling was conducted under strict protocols to ensure legality and absolute accuracy, with every step supervised by independent forensic experts to eliminate any possibility of error or future dispute. Biological samples from the individual bearing the substitute identity were collected under tightly controlled conditions, in parallel with samples from surviving biological family members of Anthony Alexander, to create a complete comparison dataset. The process was not rushed but carried out with utmost caution, as the investigators understood that an inaccurate result at this stage would not only collapse the entire hypothesis, but also cause profound harm to people who had been entangled in the case for decades. Once the DNA samples reached the laboratory, analysis was performed to the highest standards of modern forensics, focusing on establishing direct blood relationships rather than the indirect genealogical links used in the earlier phase. Results underwent multiple rounds of verification for consistency, with each genetic marker independently compared to rule out technical discrepancies. When the final results were compiled, they showed a level of biological match that left no reasonable doubt, confirming that the individual bearing the substitute identity and the child Anthony Alexander, who disappeared in 1972, were the same person biologically. This was no longer a probability or high likelihood, but a clear scientific conclusion strong enough to withstand any legal or expert challenge. The biological confirmation immediately changed the status of the entire case, from an investigation verifying a hypothesis to one with a confirmed identity. However, the process did not end with the scientific conclusion. For that truth to be officially recognized, corresponding legal procedures had to be completed. The team worked closely with judicial authorities to update personal records, determining how to legally record the new identity without erasing the administrative history that had existed for years. This was a complex issue requiring balance between acknowledging biological truth and respecting legal rights established under the substitute identity. Every decision was grounded in current law to ensure that identity confirmation did not produce unintended legal consequences. As legal procedures were finalized, official documents were adjusted to reflect the new conclusion. Anthony Alexander's file was updated to confirmed identity status, while notes regarding the substitute identity were added to ensure transparency and historical traceability. This carried not only administrative but symbolic meaning, as for the first time in over 2 decades, the name Anthony Alexander was no longer an unresolved entry on the missing children list, but reattached to a living person with a concrete presence in society. The update was performed carefully to ensure all related databases from local to federal reflected the same conclusion, preventing contradictory parallel information. Along with updating personal records, the missing person file status was officially changed. The Anthony Alexander case was moved from unresolved missing person to confirmed victim alive. This procedural step held great significance for both the investigative system and the victim's family, marking the first time since 1972 that the case was no longer defined by absence and uncertainty, but by a specific conclusion based on scientific evidence. However, changing the status did not mean the case was fully closed. It only confirmed the most critical part of the story: the victim's identity and existence. Within the investigative team, the identity confirmation phase was regarded as a historic milestone, not only for this case, but for how the system handles long-term missing persons cases, proving that cases seemingly buried by time could still be resolved with the right tools and mindset. Yet the investigators were also acutely aware that a decisive biological conclusion did not automatically explain everything that had occurred during the years. Anthony lived under another identity. The confirmation opened new questions about responsibility, the formation of the substitute identity, and the roles of individuals or systems involved in that process. On a personal level, identity confirmation placed Anthony in an entirely new position, no longer merely someone with a vague origin story, but the center of a case proven by science. This carried profound psychological and social consequences, but within this phase, the focus remained on completing necessary confirmation steps to ensure the truth was properly recorded in legal and investigative systems. Every subsequent step had to build on this foundation, as without official confirmation, any further analysis or action would lack solid grounding. Once all procedures were completed and records updated, the Anthony Alexander case officially entered a new state in which identity was no longer an open question but a proven fact. This transition not only closed a long chapter of uncertainty, but laid the groundwork for subsequent phases of the story, where the focus would no longer be finding Anthony, but confronting the consequences of his having lived so long under another identity, and how the system would respond to the newly confirmed truth. At this moment, however, the most important thing was that an irreversible conclusion had been recorded. Anthony Alexander was no longer a name in a missing persons file, but a person whose identity had been confirmed through biological and legal evidence, ending more than 2 decades of existing in a nameless limbo for both his biological family and the investigative system. After Anthony Alexander's identity was officially confirmed both biologically and legally, the focus of the case shifted away from files and data to an entirely different phase in which people became central, and every decision had to be weighed, not only by law but by psychological understanding. Arranging the meeting between Anthony and his biological family was handled with extreme care, involving coordination among investigators, psychological experts, and the individuals themselves. This was not a simple reunion, but the first time in 28 years that biological ties abruptly severed were placed in the same space. The investigators understood that although DNA had confirmed blood relations, human reunion could not be taken for granted or assumed easy. Therefore, all preparations focused on minimizing psychological shock and creating a neutral, safe environment in which both sides could confront the truth in the least damaging way possible. The meeting was not rushed and proceeded only with the consent of all involved. Anthony, now an adult with a life, memories and identity formed over nearly 3 decades, had to face the reality that his biological family not only existed, but had been waiting for him all that time. Meanwhile, the Alexander family had to confront the image of a grown man instead of the 7-year-old child they had lost. This disparity created a psychological gap that could not be erased by a single encounter, yet the DNA confirmation of blood ties served as an undeniable anchor, giving both sides a common foundation from which to begin reconnection. When the meeting took place, the psychological impact was evident on both sides, but in very different ways. For the biological family, especially the parents, confirmation that Anthony was alive was both a release from decades-long pain and the start of a new loss, as they had to face the fact that most of their child's life had unfolded beyond their reach, without their presence, shared memories, or parental role in the most important stages. Reunion feelings were thus intertwined with regret, guilt, and self-questioning about what might have been done differently. For Anthony, the psychological impact had a different tone. He was not only meeting his biological family, but also restructuring his entire self-perception. The identity he had carried for years was not legally negated, but it now had to coexist with a biological and historical truth he had never directly experienced. Facing people who shared his blood yet were complete strangers placed Anthony in a dual state. He felt a natural, hard-to-explain connection, while remaining acutely aware of the distance created by time and experience. This made the reunion not a complete return, but an intersection between two long-separated life paths. Scientific confirmation of blood ties, though proven, still needed to be internalized emotionally. This process did not happen instantly, but unfolded through multiple interactions, moments of silence, and efforts to understand one another in the new context. Supporting psychologists observed that both sides had to adjust expectations. The biological family could not expect Anthony to resume the role of a child who had never left, while Anthony could not immediately feel the bond he had with relationships formed over long years. Adapting to the new reality thus became a slow process requiring patience and acceptance that this relationship would develop in its own way, unbound by traditional patterns. The reunion after 28 years also highlighted differences in lived experience. While the Alexander family carried memories of prolonged loss, Anthony carried memories of a different life with relationships, habits, and values that had shaped him. Reconciling these realities was not only personal, but a psychological challenge, requiring each side to acknowledge that neither had lived a wrong life, only lives shaped by an event beyond anyone's control. In the adaptation process, questions of roles, boundaries, and expectations became crucial. Anthony had to define his place in the biological family, without negating the life he had built, while the Alexander family had to learn to approach their son as an adult with autonomy and distinct identity, not as a child needing compensation or protection. This adjustment was not smooth in every moment. There were times of heightened emotion, prolonged silences, and moments when both sides felt out of place in the very reunion they had longed for. Yet despite the complexity and challenges, the reunion carried undeniable meaning. It ended Anthony's nameless state in his biological family's history, and gave the Alexander family an answer they had awaited for nearly 3 decades. Anthony's presence, though different from initial imaginings, was living proof that the 1972 loss had not ended in death or permanent disappearance, but in a life that continued in ways no one could have predicted. Adapting to the new reality was not a destination, but an open journey, in which each interaction helped shape the future relationship. All involved understood that lost time could never be fully recovered, yet they also recognized that having the chance to start again, however late, was rare and not granted to every family in similar circumstances. The reunion after 28 years was therefore not seen as a perfect ending, but as a new chapter in which truth had been confirmed, people had been reconnected, and the healing process, imperfect as it might be, could finally begin on the foundation of truth and Anthony Alexander's actual existence. From the moment Anthony Alexander's identity was confirmed and the reunion took place, the focus of the case shifted once again, no longer revolving around the question of where the victim was or whether he was still alive, but centering on tracing back the process that had led the boy to leave his biological family and survive for many years under a different identity. The dedicated investigation team understood that finding the victim did not equate to clarifying criminal responsibility, as the nearly 3-decade time gap had significantly altered the legal context, the ability to gather evidence, and the status of the individuals involved. The initial investigative direction focused on tracing back the person or persons who had directly raised Anthony in the early years after his disappearance. This was a necessary step to determine whether the creation of the alternate identity stemmed from an intentional kidnapping or from a subsequent series of legitimizing decisions. Investigators reviewed adoption records, guardianship documents, and administrative files related to those who had legally appeared in Anthony's life. The goal was not only to identify them, but also to clarify their role in establishing and maintaining an unclear origin story. However, this process quickly encountered major limitations. Many involved individuals had passed away, records were lost or incomplete, and administrative decisions made in the lax legal environment of the 1970s blurred the line between wrongdoing and systemic shortcomings. Alongside tracing the caregivers, the possibility of accomplices was raised as a hypothesis to consider, since taking a child from his biological family and legitimizing his identity over a long period could hardly occur in complete isolation. The team examined the potential involvement of intermediaries, from informal adoption brokers to those assisting with paperwork. However, identifying accomplices in a context where evidence had been eroded by time posed a major challenge. Many potential connections existed only on logical inference without physical evidence to prove them, and any statements, if available, were indirect and lacked the reliability needed for criminal proceedings. Late evidence collection became the central obstacle of this phase, as most actions under investigation had occurred decades earlier. Crime scenes no longer existed, physical evidence had not been preserved, and the memories of those involved had either faded or been affected by time. Investigators had to rely on old paper records, administrative decisions, and scattered pieces of information to reconstruct the chain of events, but this method only allowed for a general picture rather than specific evidence for each violation, while criminal procedure standards require a much higher level of proof. In addition to evidentiary difficulties, the statute of limitations emerged as a decisive factor in the feasibility of criminal prosecution. Investigators and legal advisors had to match each potential act against the legal framework applicable at the time of the incident, as many offenses, especially those related to kidnapping, document forgery, or adoption procedure violations, had long expired. Even in cases where individual responsibility could be identified, prosecution might still be legally impossible. This created an emotionally hard-to-accept paradox. The truth was clarified, but criminal justice could not be enforced. Within the investigation team, this phase was viewed as a continual balancing act between pursuing accountability to the end and acknowledging the insurmountable limits of the legal system. The investigators understood that their task was not only to uncover the truth, but also to assess how that truth could be handled within the current legal framework. This distinction was particularly important to avoid creating unrealistic expectations for the victim's family, who might hope that finding Anthony would lead to punishing those responsible for the 1972 disappearance. Although not every act could be prosecuted, investigating the perpetrators after locating the victim still held significant meaning on multiple levels. It helped clarify the nature of the case, whether it was an organized crime, an individual decision, or the result of a chain of systemic errors, while also illuminating the moral responsibility of those involved, even if legal responsibility was no longer enforceable. This clarification contributed to completing the overall picture of the case, transforming it from a missing person story into a resolved file regarding mechanisms and causes. This late investigation also raised broader questions about how the system had operated in the past, how legal and administrative loopholes could be exploited, and how time could both conceal and protect wrongdoing from accountability. For Anthony, knowing what happened held not only legal but also personal significance, as it helped him better understand the path that led to his current identity, even though that understanding could not change the past. As the perpetrator investigation phase approached its limits, the task force had to confront an unavoidable reality. Finding the victim was a major victory, but it did not always enable full criminal accountability. The truth could be confirmed, identity restored, but traditional justice was sometimes unattainable due to the constraints imposed by time. In this context, the Anthony Alexander case clearly illustrated the difference between uncovering the truth and enforcing the law, a difference that did not diminish the value of the investigation, but emphasized that not every question could be fully answered within the criminal framework, even when the victim had been found and the truth revealed. From the efforts to trace back responsibility after locating Anthony Alexander, one reality became increasingly clear. Although the case had been clarified regarding the victim's identity and fate, it remained shrouded in legal limitations that were difficult to overcome. The lack of physical evidence was the biggest barrier, as most actions under review had occurred in the early 1970s, when crime scenes were not preserved to modern standards. Any existing physical evidence had not been collected or stored, or had been destroyed per administrative procedures over the years. This made proving the elements of a crime with direct evidence nearly impossible, especially for charges related to kidnapping, unlawful detention, or document forgery, which require a clear chain of evidence to establish specific criminal acts. Alongside the shortage of physical evidence was the fact that key witnesses had died, or were no longer capable of providing reliable testimony. Many individuals who could have played a pivotal role in clarifying how Anthony was taken and his identity legitimized were no longer alive, while the survivors held only indirect memories affected by time. Human memory after decades no longer meets the accuracy standard required for criminal proceedings, especially when statements are not supported by physical evidence or independent documents. This significantly weakened the ability to build a prosecution file strong enough to hold up in court. In this context, the conclusion that there were insufficient grounds for prosecution became an unavoidable legal outcome, not because no wrongdoing had occurred in the past, but because the legal system requires a specific threshold of proof to ensure that every charge is handled fairly and accurately. Prosecutors reviewing the file had to face the question not of whether something happened, but whether they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and in this case, the answer often leaned toward no, as gaps in evidence and witnesses could not be filled with inference or probability, even when the overall picture strongly suggested a chain of wrongful acts. The limitations of the legal system were clearly exposed in how the case was handled at this stage. Criminal law is designed to address acts within a certain time frame and conditions where evidence can be collected, preserved, and examined promptly. When the time gap is too long, the system must prioritize protecting the rights of potential defendants against wrongful conviction over meeting emotional justice demands. This created a hard-to-accept gap for the victim's family, who might feel that the truth had been confirmed, but responsibility was not assigned accordingly. In the Anthony Alexander case, legal limitations stemmed not only from statutes of limitations but also from changes in the law over time. Many acts that would constitute serious crimes in a modern context might have been viewed only as administrative violations or handled under different standards in the 1970s legal framework. Retroactive application of criminal law is prohibited, preventing authorities from using modern standards to evaluate and prosecute past acts, even if their consequences persist to the present. Another limitation lay in the structure of the justice system itself, where each criminal case requires a specific defendant, a specific act, and a direct chain of evidence linking the two. Meanwhile, this case was systemic and dispersed, involving multiple administrative decisions, multiple individuals at different times, and no single moment that could be pinpointed as the central criminal act. This dispersion made personalizing responsibility difficult, as even if the system's failure could be identified, the system itself is not an entity that can be criminally prosecuted. For Anthony and his biological family, confronting these legal limitations was an emotionally complex experience, as it forced them to accept that legal justice might not be achievable, even though the truth had been clarified. This acceptance did not mean denying the value of the investigation process, but it required adjusting expectations, shifting focus from seeking punishment to understanding what happened, and why the system allowed it. In many cases, this understanding became the only form of closure attainable. From the perspective of law enforcement agencies, the Anthony Alexander case became a typical example of the system's inherent limitations when facing cases spanning decades. It showed that even with modern technology and advanced biological data, the law remains bound by fundamental principles of evidence, statutes of limitations, and human rights, principles that protect society from abuse of power, but also create gaps where justice cannot be fully enforced as victims expect. These legal limitations did not invalidate the value of finding Anthony, but they shaped how the case was legally concluded, not with a verdict or trial but with the acknowledgement that the system had done everything possible within allowed boundaries, and that some stories, though clarified, cannot be fully resolved through criminal proceedings. In this context, the Anthony Alexander case raised a broader question about how society defines justice in cases where time has removed the ability to prosecute, and whether truth, recognition, and reunion can become an alternative form of justice, existing alongside but not replacing the law. When authorities officially recorded that there were insufficient grounds to prosecute any involved individual, it was not a declaration of innocence or lack of responsibility, but an acknowledgement of the legal system's limits in addressing past wrongs when necessary conditions no longer exist. This acknowledgement closed the criminal prosecution path, but opened space for social and systemic evaluations, where the question was no longer who would be prosecuted, but how the system needed to change to prevent similar cases in the future. It was from this tension between confirmed truth and unenforceable justice that the Anthony Alexander case became a profound lesson about what the law can and cannot do, even when every effort has been made to seek answers over nearly 3 decades. From the moment the legal limitations were officially acknowledged and the criminal prosecution path closed, the Anthony Alexander case did not reach a state of completeness, as while the biological truth had been confirmed but responsibility could not be assigned, the unanswered questions became the most persistent remaining part of the entire story. First and foremost was how the initial abduction occurred, as although the hypothesis that Anthony was taken by an adult had been strengthened through various analyses, no direct evidence showed exactly how the moment the boy left his family's supervision unfolded, whether it was a premeditated act prepared in advance, an exploitation of a momentary lapse in the urban environment of the time, or a series of opportunistic decisions covered by social and administrative loopholes. This question held not only the meaning of reconstructing the event, but also determined how society understood the nature of the case, as an individual crime, or a consequence of overlapping systemic factors. When the abduction method remained unclear, the issue of overlooked responsibility became particularly troubling, as throughout the reinvestigation, many decisions, breaking points, and shortcomings were identified, but could not be directly tied to a specific individual. Responsibility in this case became dispersed, spanning from those directly involved in raising and legitimizing the identity to agencies, processes, and societal norms of that era. The questions raised were not only who did what, but also who failed to do something, who did not ask the right questions at the right time, who accepted opaque documents as normal, and who allowed a missing child to blend into the system undetected. The roles of those involved thus became a gray area difficult to define, as not every individual participating in forming the alternate identity necessarily acted with criminal intent. Some may have acted based on provided information, Others followed lax administrative procedures without realizing long-term consequences, while the possibility remained that some knew the child's illegal origin, but chose silence or active concealment. This mix of unintentional negligent and intentional actions made assigning responsibility more complex than in any ordinary criminal case, and with so much time passed, the boundaries between those roles became even harder to definitively determine. These questions extended not only to the past but also to the present and future, particularly the possibility of similar undetected cases. If one child could be taken, have his identity legitimized, and live for decades without detection, there was no guarantee Anthony Alexander was the only one. The case thus became a worrying indicator of what might have happened in the same historical period, when adoption systems, civil registration, and missing persons investigations operated separately without effective cross-checking mechanisms. The question arose, how many other missing persons files ended similarly, but were never reconnected due to lack of biological data or suitable technology to reactivate investigations? The existence of these possibilities elevated the Anthony Alexander case beyond a personal story. It became a case study on systemic limits and long-term consequences when those limits were exploited or ignored. The unanswered questions thus belonged not only to the victim's family or investigators, but to society as a whole, about how the most vulnerable children could be lost from collective sight, not in dramatic circumstances, but in ordinary moments where trust, habit, and lack of vigilance intersect. The inability to clearly determine the initial abduction method also complicated psychological healing, as both Anthony and his biological family had to live with unresolved gaps, questions no one could answer with certainty. This forced them to accept an incomplete form of closure, where the truth was confirmed at its most basic level, but key details remained out of reach. This acceptance was not resignation, but a way to continue living without being trapped in unverifiable assumptions. At the systemic level, the unanswered questions demanded a re-evaluation of how authorities assess and handle missing children cases, not only in modern contexts, but also in reviewing old files, as the Anthony Alexander case showed that finding the victim does not always come from traditional clues, but can come from entirely different tools and perspectives. This raised the question of how many other cold cases could be reactivated, if approached similarly, and whether the system has the resources and will to pursue those possibilities. Ultimately, the unanswered questions of the case did not exist to diminish the value of what was achieved, but to remind that truth rarely arrives in complete form, especially when time has deeply intervened in every aspect of the story. The Anthony Alexander case closed many important chapters, but left some pages unwritten, not due to lack of effort, but because some things were permanently taken by time. And in that incompleteness, the story forces confrontation with a hard but necessary reality. Sometimes, finding the victim and restoring their identity is the highest level of justice society can achieve, while the unanswered questions continue to exist as a warning, reminding of what was once overlooked and what must not be repeated. From the unanswered questions that could not be fully resolved, the Anthony Alexander case reached a distinctive conclusion, where the concept of solved was no longer understood in the traditional sense of a criminal case, with perpetrators arrested and convicted, but redefined based on the core goal of a missing child case, determining the fate and identity of the victim. In this instance, the case was considered solved because Anthony Alexander had been found, biologically confirmed, and restored to his true identity, after nearly 3 decades living under a different name. The central truth of the matter, that the child missing since 1972 was not dead, not vanished forever, but had lived another life, was finally clarified by irrefutable scientific evidence, even though the path to that truth did not end with a criminal conviction. Redefining solved in this case reflected an important reality of modern cold cases, especially those involving children, where time often removes the ability to pursue legal accountability, but does not necessarily remove the ability to confirm truth. Here justice arrived not in the form of punishment, but in the form of recognition, recognizing that Anthony Alexander existed, that his biological family had not searched in vain, and that the system, though delayed, could eventually reconnect the separated pieces. At the heart of this outcome was the revolutionary role of DNA in cold case investigations, as without modern biotechnology, and particularly genetic genealogy, this case would almost certainly have remained archived like thousands of other missing persons files from the previous century. DNA overcame the traditional limits of investigations relying on witnesses, physical evidence, and human memory, allowing the system to trace back biological origins, even when identity had been completely altered and legitimized over years. In the Anthony Alexander case, DNA was not just a confirmation tool but the only bridge between a missing child in the 1972 records and an adult living in modern society. This role highlighted the enormous potential of biotechnology in reactivating cases thought to have no further progress. However, the case's outcome also exposed complex social and legal consequences, as finding the victim did not mean the system could correct every past error. Limitations on evidence, statutes of limitations, and legal structure prevented criminal responsibility from being imposed, creating a sense of incompleteness in traditional justice perception, while forcing society to confront the difficult question: does justice exist only with punishment, or can restoring identity, truth, and healing opportunities for the victim and family also be seen as another form of justice? The Anthony Alexander case leaned toward the latter, not because it was perfect, but because that was the maximum justice the system could achieve given time's deep intervention in every aspect. On a broader level, the case left clear lessons for child protection efforts. First was the importance of data integration and strict oversight of processes involving vulnerable children, especially adoption and guardianship. The loopholes of the 1970s allowed a child to be taken and his identity legitimized undetected, and although today's legal context has changed significantly, this case reminded that the system is only safe when checking, cross-verification, and tracing mechanisms are continuously maintained, not relying on assumptions of good faith or administrative convenience. The second lesson lay in how society approaches long-term missing children cases. The Anthony Alexander case showed that a file becoming a cold case should not mean it is permanently frozen, as technological advances can turn old dead ends into new opportunities. This requires law enforcement not only to preserve files, but also to proactively re-evaluate them when conditions change, especially as DNA and biological data increasingly play a central role in modern investigations. Finally, the case emphasized the importance of placing the victim at the center of the case-solved concept. For many years, Anthony Alexander existed as a name on a missing persons list, but the final outcome was not just removing the name from that list, but acknowledging a person with a complex history, irreversible losses, and the right to know who he is. In that sense, the case did not just resolve a file, but restored part of an identity stolen by circumstances and time. Looking back at the entire journey from 1972 to 2000, the Anthony Alexander case was not a story of a system triumphing over crime, but of how truth can be found even late, how technology can compensate for past limitations, and how society must learn to accept imperfect but deeply meaningful endings. In that definition, solved was not the end of all questions, but the end of anonymity, where a missing child was finally returned his real name, real history, and real place in the world, and that was the greatest significance this case left behind. Looking at the Anthony Alexander story from American life today, The biggest lesson does not lie in the miracle of DNA, but in the chain of very ordinary decisions that opened the door to tragedy. In 1972, the Alexander family lived in a peaceful Wilmington, where children had more freedom and adults tended to reassure themselves when seeing a stranger passing by or a slightly unusual situation. It was that reflex of suspecting, then dismissing, that created a monitoring gap of just a few minutes, enough for Anthony to disappear. Therefore, in today's reality, the most useful thing is to establish clear family rules. Children must know meeting points, a family password to confirm pickup persons, and the principle of stop, find an adult, call for help when approached by anyone. For parents, practice the habit of speaking directly to children and each other about danger signals, strangers asking for directions, offering gifts, asking for help finding a pet, instead of seeing it as a sensitive topic hard to discuss. The story also shows that the first 72 hours can easily go off track when the community thinks probably just wandered off, causing hot leads to cool. If facing a similar situation, report to police immediately, provide consistent descriptions, and ask neighbors to preserve memories as soon as possible, who saw what vehicle, which direction, avoiding spreading rumors that distort statements. Finally, the case reminds that loopholes in paperwork and off-system adoptions can legitimize a disappearance. In today's American society, treat transparent records, guardianship, adoption, birth certificates, and storing family data like photos, medical records, and relative information as long-term protection, because when needed that very data can become the lifeline to reconnect a person with their true identity. If you find the story of Anthony Alexander makes you reflect on what can be missed in silence, and how the truth ultimately finds its way back, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in cold cases that seemed forever unsolved. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video, where another story will remind us that behind every name is a real life.